In the world of medicine, where every decision can change lives, your peace of mind is crucial. This is where Pattern steps in. Imagine insurance made simple, fast, and personalized, just for you. With Pattern, you're not just getting disability and life insurance, you're insuring your future and protecting your greatest asset, your income. In the past 10 years, Pattern has transformed the way over 20,000 doctors secure their financial well-being. Discover the simplicity of securing your future at patternlife.com or click the link in the description. What's different about behavior change in high achievers like ourselves? Stay tuned and find out. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast today. This was a connection made on social media. So on today's episode, we have Dr. Shin Ock, who is a clinical psychologist and founder of Ezar Psychology. So she specializes in us. She specializes in providing actionable therapy for folks that she calls exhausted exemplars, us pillars of society. So especially focused on physician, mental health, and other high achievers. So Dr. Ock, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was exciting to be invited.
First, start off, how did you end up in this particular niche of physician mental health?
I like to say that it kind of started by accident. I come from an academic medical sort of background. I've always worked in the health psychology space throughout my training. And so I've been embedded in various medical departments, various healthcare settings. And through that, I had to develop, strong working relationships with physicians and other healthcare providers. It really became more of a clear commitment on my part to physician mental health during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, when just the volume and acuity and demands placed on providers became even more overwhelming than they had already been. And the resources that were available became even less and fewer. It's sort of impromptu, people were pulling me aside to consult on their patients, and we ended up talking about other things and sort of caring for the whole person of the provider and not just the patients that they were caring for. I ended up having physicians and other healthcare providers on my patient panels, and that became a little bit confusing sometimes because there's the issue of multiple relationships, but I worked in large enough settings that it wasn't so much of an issue. And I enjoy working with my physician colleagues, and I had a big heart for helping them to do what they needed to do, not just as providers and, pillars of society and all of these things, but as people, because at the end of the day, you all are human beings and you all have the same drives and needs and vulnerabilities as everyone else, but I think oftentimes feel that you have less access to the same resources because in some ways you have to maintain some authority, some semblance of professionalism, some sense of health, some sort of exemplary status. Now in my own practice, people can come to me and they don't have to sort of do it on the down low or anything like that on your own time. People come talk, solve problems and work with somebody who really understands kind of where they're coming from. Because even though the needs, basically might be the same, I think the way that changes or actions or whatever are implemented have to be done, I think, a little more carefully. I think there's a lot less margin for error or anything like that when people who are so busy, so overwhelmed, have so much riding on them doing a good job, have to change course.
So the reason that this interview is happening is because I had done a couple of episodes on behavior change, really geared towards our patients. I did an episode a long time ago with BJ Fogg on tiny habits, and then Kyra Bobinet with iterative mindset, and Jason Reha, we talked about the difference between, a habit and a routine. how those need to be separate things. And Dr. Gina Clino, we had talked about ways to start and keep habits. So I did a whole series of this for our patients. As with most things, we think about our patients and we don't think as much about ourselves. And so you chimed in on your social media and you're like, hey, there's something here, that's different for physicians. Behavior change in physicians and other high achievers, that's something that you know about. And so let's talk about let's talk about how we can help ourselves, be the best versions of ourselves, as I like to say on the show. What are some of the common behavior changes that physicians try to make?
I think it's not necessarily specific to physicians, but there are some sort of similar profiles for people who are sort of high achieving, well-educated folks that are very goal-oriented or used to sort of accomplishing things that are given to them. It's not necessarily that there are common behavior changes that they're trying to make, because I think everyone could benefit from, engaging in more healthful habits, resting more, being better at solving conflicts, addressing maybe problematic behavior such as substance use, misuse, things like that. But I think the difference is that the self-expectations for people who are really high achieving or used to being the one sort of telling people what to do is very different. It's almost, you hear this a lot, right? In colloquially, do as I do, not as I say.
Yeah.
Right? Where the things that are good for us are the same, but our ability to apply them sort of feels separate from the general population for some reason. And that's a lot of kind of what I question in the work with my physicians of why do you have a hard time doing the things that are good? It's not a matter of knowing, because
Yeah.
Right. You've done all the modules. Yeah. You've taken all the courses. You've read all the literature. You've even told your patients to do these things. You've even told your colleagues, right? But why is it different for you? That's a big question.
Okay. So I've heard that referred to as the know-do gap. I know what to do, but I don't do it. The gap between knowing and doing. It sounds like what you're saying is we think that we're different from other people because we've spent our whole lives achieving, and yet we're really not. When it comes to all of these behavior modifications that we want to make, we have the same trappings and fallibilities as everybody else, which is why it's challenging to do. So we're good at telling people what to do. And there's the rub. That's why I did those episodes, is because we do know what to do. We have trouble teaching people how to do it. Like lifestyle change.
Yeah.
Fine. Try hypnotism, try the gum, try this. But like with regards to behavior change, we don't really have like a great roadmap. We don't learn that in medical school because it's just the science is still really not great with regards to how to get people to change.
Well, I think it's important to sort of figure out what the common roadblocks are. And I think for folks who are used to knowing a lot, intellectualization is a really common, I would say, coping mechanism, where it kind of feels like we're doing something by learning something, but that isn't really the case because, your wife doesn't care that you should do this thing, right? Your patient doesn't care that that you should, oh, I'm so sorry, be a little bit more compassionate. They don't care that that you do. I think this intellectualization piece is really prominent.
Intellectualization piece. I just want to explore that a little before we move on. It sounds like one of the things that I might do would be like analysis paralysis. So like my earbuds broke. I already lost them again, whatever, and I need a new pair. So I go like researching, and the difference between them is probably marginal. And then I never end up buying them, so that I don't go running because I don't have new earbuds. Meanwhile, I should have just like picked whatever was on sale. So I've like analysis paralysis where I take this deep dive, but never end up pulling the trigger on the thing that needs to happen.
Yeah. So that is, I think, intellectualization can certainly contribute to that. I think intellectualization is often sort of, I know what the right thing is. I know I can name what's happening. And therefore I've figured it out, right? And it's like, okay, well, what's happening?
Okay.
Yeah. Let's do the hard thing.
It. Yeah.
But in that taking the step, right, making the decision to buy the headphones or to do something, of bigger consequence, it can be really challenging. I think often I hear this sort of fear of making the wrong choice, fear of some sort of significant consequence. I think in terms of patient care, I often hear, I'm going to miss something. And it's going to impact the quality of care. It's going to impact my reputation, all of these things. And then even with choosing the right headphones, right? This idea that there is some sort of intangible, knowable best thing. And this sort of black and white thinking that every other option is therefore bad, right?
The
It
headphone analogy still works. There's one right pair and the rest of them are wrong. What am I
And are you hearing me through your headphones? We have different headphones and I can hear you as well.
Just fine, yeah. Imagine that. Yeah.
Imagine.
So we don't need to overthink it. Okay, so we drew that in terms of like behavior. Like, okay, so I'm going to start eating better. I need to eat more carrots and kale. And so which type of kale should it be? And which type of dressing is better than other type of dressing? Like that type of thing. When you say intellectualization, give me a more concrete example of overthinking.
Overthinking. Okay, so I was recently working with a physician who was sort of trying to decide what to do in the context of a romantic partner relationship. Okay. And this physician could name all of the reasons, all of the patterns that, the famous researchers on relationships could identify as being problematic, all of the processes in which conflict was happening in these patterns. And yet, when it came to a point of action, right, a point of either changing how he's engaging with his partner or even changing the existence, the status of that relationship, felt very stuck. And so it's not the knowing that's the issue, right? There are all of these underlying sort of emotional components that are much harder to deal with. Okay. And I think for physicians, often you're very good at achieving without addressing. So in training often, and in med school and all these things where you have more things to do than you have time. You have more things to do than you have breath, right? Yeah. You hear or are taught or you adapt to just sort of suppress any sort of upcoming emotion in order to survive the next 6 weeks, in order to address whatever crisis is happening, or in order to just get the thing done. We never really learn how to turn it back on. We get very good at focusing on the goal, at focusing on the behavior that we need to achieve, that we're not necessarily experiencing the full gamut of human emotions, right? That are often informative and often important in order to help us make decisions that are more aligned with what internally we need to do, right? It's very different than doing something that is required of you, right? But doing something that you want to do or how you want to be requires introspection, maybe some dealing with some uncomfortable emotions, and being able to even acknowledge those emotions, much less tolerate them, and then make a decision based on them and other information. That's a very different skill.
Interesting. I apologize. I'm still not clear on how that relates to behavior change, because I'm just thinking back to when I was a resident. And yes, you've got your list of things to do, and it doesn't matter if you're hungry, you're thirsty, you need to pee, whatever, you're in pain, whatever, you just push through and you get it done. You triage it and you get it done. You just get the work done. And then kind of that continues to be how I think many of us, like, I'm not the same person that I was before residency training, right? Like it changed who I am. I am now much more, as you said, goal-oriented. There's a list of stuff that needs to get done in this house, even when I'm not at work, in this house. And I'm not going to sit down and relax until either I'm exhausted and can't do anymore, or wow, this is really turning into a therapy session for me, which was not the idea.
All the time. Happens all the time.
I've either achieved everything that I deem as being enough that I can sit and enjoy, or I'm just so exhausted that I just crash. It's gotten in the way of me being able to enjoy my family because there are dishes that need to be done. There's laundry that needs to be done. Like they need to get their stuff ready for school. And some days I'm home in the morning. I usually wake up with my kids. I don't get them ready for school though. My wife does that, but I wake up first with them to let her sleep a little longer because they still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and they wake her up. So a little glimpse into our life, right? So it's nice. We've got a nice balance. It works for both of us. But then on those days where I happen to be home, how come there's stuff like it's not right? She's like, I do this every day with them and they are on time every day. Would you just, but like this list needs to get done and I can't turn that off. So is that what you're referring to?
So what are we talking about in terms of behavior change, right? You're talking about a lot of behaviors that you're already doing. And when we talk about behavior change, we're talking about things that actually need to be different than how we are already doing it.
Behavior change is these are things that you want to do more of or things that you want to do less of. So like,
yes,
you want to eat better, you want to exercise more, you want to be more social, because that's, again, that's a determinant of health that we really need to advocate for more of in ourselves and our patients. Less screen time, being more present with your family, your friends, any of those things. So, you can take any one of them if you want to use that as an example.
We have to take a step back, right? What is or is not happening that you want to be happening more of or less of, right? Because you're doing a lot of things, right? But what is the thing that your wife is asking you to do differently?
Which is like, just chill out.
That's
out. What she's asking me to do.
Yes. Okay. So you've hit a really common thing. Okay. Oh. This is a thing I hear all the time. How many times have you experienced or have you heard someone else say, I finally have a break, but I don't know what I'm going to do with myself? The thing that needs to change isn't that I need to do more things. I want to change my ability to do less things, not because everything is done, but because it's time to do less things. There is always more to do. So what is the thing that's holding you back from making that change? From people you care about are asking you to do it. You state that you want to do it. You recognize even the benefits of doing something differently, but there's still something holding you back. And that's where that emotional piece comes in. Because we actually do the things that are emotionally the easiest to do. I know that sounds crazy, right? When a lot of the things that you're doing are actually quite difficult on its face. But either it's supported by adrenaline, it's supported by external expectations, it's supported by something. But that internal world is actually, I think, the hardest thing for many, many people, especially who are very driven, very goal-oriented, all these things, is struggling to address and change the things that are internal, personal, unseen, that require more access and maybe dealing with the stuff that's going on inside, right? What comes up for you? I don't want to make it too much of a therapy session for Dr. Bradley Bach, right? But when someone says, chill out.
I put myself out there. Like the whole premise of the podcast is if I'm struggling with these questions, I am sure other people are struggling with them too. So let's get them in, whether it's about advocacy or personal finance or whatever. And just another extra special glimpse into my pathology, something that I had talked about with a previous therapist was I would get home from work. If it was bedtime, I knew what to do with my kids. Pajamas, get them cleaned up, get them teeth brushed, read them a book, get them in bed. I had my list of things to do and I knew exactly what to do. But if I got home early, I didn't know what to do. I'm a fun dad. Like we have a good time. But I struggled with that, like this nebulousness of not having my, how crazy is that? That's crazy. Even saying that now. Now, if I took current Brad and put him in the head of previous Brad, I wouldn't have that problem anymore. When you're describing this to me, it just, it makes me remember back to that previous issue, and it all seems so intertwined.
This idea of doing the right thing when you know the thing that needs to be done. And so what do you do when there is no norm or there is no standard to meet. That's your decision. And it can be really paralyzing, right? We get lost. We try to find out more information. We try to have someone else tell us what to do. Ask your wife, just tell me what I should do. And she's like, hang out. And it almost feels
like, what's wrong with you? Just hang out.
Where it doesn't have to be productive. It doesn't have to have any sort of measurable value beyond your presence and your connection, which is actually quite, I think, a vulnerable feeling of, I don't actually know. Right? I don't know is such a vulnerable thing to say, and is almost forbidden in some of the contexts that we exist in, right?
Yes.
We can sort of theoretically or intellectually, right, acknowledge that, oh yes, we should be able to say that. But in practice, how often does that happen?
It's hard to say.
Right?
It's hard to say, and especially in our profession, it's hard to say. I've gotten much better at saying it as like a mid-career physician than I was as an early career physician. Just be like,
it's almost, it feels foreign coming out of the mouth, right? And the enactment of not knowing, the enactment of not having a thing to accomplish, but wanting to be present in that, that's a change, right?
Yeah.
That's meaning it's different from the baseline. It's different from your norm. And so what are the emotions underlying that? And then how do we get to the point of doing the thing, right? That no-do gap, right? You know you should do it. You're being told you should do it. You're being given opportunities to do it, and you're not doing it. Why? In the work that I do with my patients, a lot of it is sort of figuring out how much of this is noise, right? How much of this is stuff that you think that you should be doing, but you're letting it in the way of all that. But then at the end of the day, and you've talked about this in previous podcasts, right? Connecting your behaviors to something superordinate. I often talk about values, right? Because they can sound very similar to goals, but they're not, because values don't actually give you anything to do in the immediate.
Actions need to be consistent with your values. Like a goal gets achieved, a value doesn't get achieved.
Mm-hmm. A value is aligned with. Yeah. A value is clarified and then committed to when you are spending time with your children and it's not bedtime. What are your values around the kind of relationship you want to have with your children, the kind of parent you want to be, the kind of spouse you want to be when you are the one being the primary parent in that moment? And then being responsive to the opportunities that are presented there, right? Either when they're like, Daddy, I want to do this or whatever, either saying yes because it's aligned with the values or redirecting, saying no because it's not aligned. Being very clear on the who you are piece helps us to then take steps towards aligning our behaviors with those values. And it's very not straightforward. I think a lot of the work that I do with my patients is strengthening their connection to their values.
It's the end of another busy day. You just saw 20, 30 patients, maybe more. Instead of heading home for dinner with your spouse or playing with your kids, you now begin your night job, charting. Charting is critical for patient care, billing, and medical legal liability, but it steals our focus from our patients, eats away at our time with our families, and keeps us up at night. The burden of always having another chart to complete drains all of us. Freed listens, prepares your notes, and writes patient instructions for you. Charting is done before your patient walks out of the room. Wait, because it gets better. Freed learns your style over time. It's AI, just like a human scribe would, except it will never quit on you. Freed is loved by 3,000 plus clinicians from every specialty. It's HIPAA compliant, takes 30 seconds to learn, and costs only $99 a month. You can try Freed for free right now by going to freed.ai, Freed.ai. Listeners of the Physician's Guide to Doctoring can use the code PGD50 for $50 off the first month. That's really interesting, tying into what we've talked about on the show with behavior change before, because if you have a goal and that goal gets achieved, what do you do with the behavior now, right? But if you have a value, then are your behaviors consistent with those values? It's a very different way to think. It's not goal-oriented, which is actually a good thing, because there's
because it's
arrival
flexible.
fallacy.
Yeah.
It's not like you're going to arrive one day and you've achieved it and then now what? Like, are my behaviors consistent with my values? And so when you're talking to people about behavior change, is that the lens through which you are looking? You like, first, let's identify your values and then let's talk about the behavior, so that that's the starting point?
I think a way to conceptualize when people walk through my door, right, my virtual door or whatever, is they often have a sense that things are not the way that they're supposed to be. They've gotten lost in the sauce. Yeah. They've become overwhelmed and maybe swept up by all of these external things. And I often hear things like, I'm not the person that I used to be, or I've changed, or I don't know who I am anymore. And yes, there are lots of actual contextual sort of things happening on the surface, too much work, documentation is difficult, really difficult patients, all of these things, but they've lost sense or maybe never knew what's most important to them. And that's especially challenging for people who your guiding light has almost always been a goal that someone else set for you.
So interesting. You didn't need to have your values so clear because you had a goal. And the minute you don't have a goal, it can leave you a little lost. So you need to identify your values. That is a really poetic way to put it. I really love that.
I am glad you love it. I love the work that I do. And because your values you carry with you everywhere you go. When I say values, right, sometimes a way that I talk to patients about sort of figuring out what they are is, end of the day, right? The house is on fire. Your career is falling apart. Everyone hates you, right? The worst case scenario. What do you need to be true about you and your life in order to feel like things are going to be okay? And that's one way of sort of clarifying. Another thing is oftentimes the things that offend us or the things that trigger us are somehow betraying the things that we think are important. And so what needs to happen to understand, clarify, and align with the things that we are committing to being the most important thing?
There was one more thing that you wanted to talk about before we go, because we're getting close to the end here. And you'd said you wanted to talk about the stigmas in seeking support for behavioral change, or just seeking support in general, if you want.
Yeah, I think especially in the professional context, and the higher you go and you sort of have less supervision, less someone who is in charge. For physicians and really high achieving folks, but in particular physicians, we kind of develop this callus of having to be as perfect as we possibly can, as productive as we possibly can be, as knowledgeable as we possibly can be, as infallible as we possibly can be. And making changes often requires, number one, admitting that something needs to change. So something about our current approach is off. And it often involves being in process, so not perfect. And it also often involves asking for support, either accountability or advice or whatever. And these all are things that I think in the professional realm don't fit well. It gets really challenging because there's almost a stigma to needing to change and make a change in any regard, whether it's a huge thing like seeking mental health care or changing up how you organize your schedule or whatever. It requires those things, and admitting that something needs to change is embarrassing, I think, sometimes. But like I mentioned, for folks who are not used to operating on a more emotional level for survival reasons, right? Any kind of difficult emotion, I think, immediately goes to shame. And shame is so hard to deal with, right? When it feels like we need to hide. When really, embarrassment and shame are cousins, but they're not the same thing, because embarrassment means, there's something about me that either did a little bit weird or I could do better. It's changing, it's being in process. And so being able to sort of show that and ask for the support that you need is really important. And that requires the people around you, but also you as a member of, whatever guild, to be okay with people making changes and needing to make changes and being in the process of making a change and asking for the support to make that change.
That comes to mind is, I'm in a position where other people have been in this position. And if they haven't needed help, why do I need help? And I think a different way to look at that would be, nobody else has asked for help before. This is a position that clearly needs help. Why don't I leave this better than I found it? And I'm going to put in place, I'm going to change this so that getting help is easier than it was when I got here. So I think we're so often like, I'm clearly the weak link here because nobody else before me needed help. But in reality, they all needed it, or most of them needed it, or some of them more desperately than you, but they never got it. There weren't processes in place. Why don't I be the person that makes the change that makes it easier for those after me?
Absolutely. I think a lot of times when my patients, who are physicians, are trying to make changes, they try to do it in secret as if they're not needing help, right? Or having support. And that perpetuates this idea that everyone around me is not getting support or not needing support. Yeah. I would also point out that the nature of the healthcare system has changed so drastically, even in the past 10, 15 years, right? Especially in the past 10, 15 years, just that the demands placed on every individual member are so high. You're not actually doing the same job that somebody before you had. And that person before you did actually have more support. They had fewer patients, maybe less acuity, less complexity, more support staff, right? Reimbursement was higher so they could afford all of these things. And so it's not that you're the only one or the first one to be the weakest link, right? It's that the task that you've been given is hard. It behooves you to do it well by getting any support that you need.
For yourself, for your family, and for your patients. Fantastic way to finish. All right, so Dr. Shin Ock, where can people find Ezar Psychology if they're interested in getting in touch?
Feel free to reach out. You can find me on Instagram. I'm at Ezar Psychology. That's also my website, ezarpsychology.com. If you would like to connect, I do offer a complimentary consult for prospective patients. It's also a place to just ask questions and maybe ask for referrals if that's what you are looking for. And you can reach me through the contact page on my website.
Well, thank you so much for your time and all that you do for us exhausted exemplars.
Thank you for having me, and happy podcasting.
Doctors dedicate our lives to caring for others. It's time someone took care of us. Visit patternlife.com to simplify your path to peace of mind. Patternlife.com, simplifying your insurance journey. Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.